Scratch is a game engine made to help 6-year-olds learn how to make games. I'm not 6. A few days ago, I tried to make an action game in Scratch with no experience and no prep work. It didn't go well. Am I dumb? Maybe. But I do know how to code and how to make games in other engines. I was surprised at how unintuitive it was to make a game in Scratch.
I feel extremely lost.
Today, I'm going to be comparing Unreal Engine to Scratch to see which is a better engine for someone who doesn't know how to code at all.
Electric Board Games.
I'm making the same game in both, a Vampire Survivors clone. This is Vampire Survivors. It's an addictive game. It's an action roguelike. The goal of the game is real simple. Survive 20 minutes. The enemies constantly spawn and run at you from all directions. All you can do is walk. You have weapons, but you don't control them. They fire automatically. This makes a game that's fairly easy to replicate. There are dozens of people doing it right now with minor twists. I decided Vampire Survivors was a perfect game to test out Scratch on. I'm a game dev, and I make YouTube videos to test ideas and see what people want. Having an engine that I can quickly prototype ideas in would be pretty useful. So I went through the process of making Vampire Survivors in Scratch with no experience and without looking up tutorials or anything ahead of time. I showed the first part of that in my previous video. I then threw a few more hours into it before deciding to drop Scratch. It was just taking way too long to do the basics. Instead, I decided to make what I had made in Scratch again in Unreal. And that took about 2 hours, and then I'd already passed what I'd done in Scratch. So let's get into the experience of both. But first, why would you use Scratch? I know a lot of people want to make games, but they don't know how to code. For them, a game engine is going to be very intimidating. Coding is hard, like really hard. Learning to code while you also are learning how to build games is a lot to handle. Scratch doesn't have code. Like I said, made for kids. You just drag blocks around and attach them. It's real simple, and it seems like it would be perfect for prototyping. It's not. Scratch has one big problem for prototyping. It doesn't do anything for you. In your typical game engine, you come up with an idea and start piecing things together with the tools that it ships with. In Unreal, you have a few different built-in game archetypes. If you pick a first-person shooter, you're going to get a character that has movement and shooting already built for you. Don't forget to shoot at the subscribe button to make sure you get more videos like this. Scratch doesn't have that.
Not have that.
You start with nothing, and you have to build all these pieces yourself.
I feel like using Scratch, it's like I'm banging my head against the wall because all the ways that I would normally approach creating like a prototype like this don't really work. It's like I'm getting contracted to come in and build a house, but all they gave me are sandcastle building tools. And I'm like, I guess I've built a sandcastle before, but it's been a minute.
This isn't so bad on its face. This is literally always going to be a hurdle in game development. It's just a question of how fast. However, in Scratch, you run into this barrier like right away.
Wait, why do the lists take up so much dang space, man? And can I not reposition the list when it's in a... Brother, y'all are not serious.
For example, Scratch doesn't have built-in collision management.
One of the things that I don't get is that there's no built-in collision system, which seems like something you would need.
You need to have basic things like characters not phasing through each other in a game. The solution is this complicated mess. You could copy it from somewhere, but good luck knowing what to even search for if you're a beginner. I just knew to look up collisions because I've done this before. Also, shout out to the Scratch forums being down while I was working on this video. Half of the things I tried to Google, I literally couldn't get a good answer for because the website wasn't up. It's not all better on Unreal though. Unreal has blueprints. It's this graph thing where you can make a whole game without coding anything. It's great in concept, beautiful in concept. Has a few problems though. Namely, where do you start? I was able to jump in and get going pretty fast. But that's because I've actually messed around in Unreal before, and even though it's been about 5 years, I can still remember the basic structure of these things. It's hard to know where any of these blueprints are supposed to go. Where you're supposed to be dropping things. There's like 70 different places you can do everything. Blueprints also require you to think like a programmer a lot of the time. Like, it's hard to imagine how much time it would take to figure out some of this basic stuff if you don't know how to program.
No, sir, we're not moving in the slightest. All I'm doing here with all these fancy, complicated blocks is I am trying to make the controls work in a very simple way. So when you press up, you're going to move up.
You gotta grab a reference to an actor or a pawn, and then cast it to the right class, and then call a function, call back that information, something in a variable, save something in a public variable, save unserialized to serialized return. It's a lot. The advantage for making a Vampire Survivors clone, though, is that a lot of it is done out of the box for you. For Scratch, I had to do some stuff to get the character moving.
This is actually, maybe I might actually be able to get this. I might actually be able to do this. And the arrows don't work right.
And even then, it didn't have any animation, and it felt really jerky.
It's not very smooth movement, to be honest, at all.
It would take a fair amount of adjustment to get it working right. In Unreal, I didn't have animations either. Unreal had the movement built in out of the box. I literally opened up template, and my guy was able to move around the screen in a way that works perfectly for Vampire Survivors. So after that, this is where things get interesting. In Scratch, you're just putting things together. It doesn't really assume that you have any prior knowledge about how to make a game, which is great, by the way, at least in concept. Unreal assumes that you at least watched some tutorials before you jump in and start making something real. I remember it was pretty hard right away when I first started to get a handle on where things were supposed to go and how you're supposed to approach it. Still, Unreal is a better engine for someone who is new to game development than Scratch. Why? Because Scratch isn't really any better about this whole tutorial thing.
I keep forgetting the forms are broken.
My problem with Scratch is that after the very basics, like moving around, making a character, it still expected me to think like a programmer. I have no problem with thinking like a programmer, but the tools are really crude here. I had to come up with really complicated solutions for basic stuff.
So I don't know why it's not spawning in the bats as it should be.
So still, like in every game engine, you have to leap from the basics into the deep end, but then you're doing it in this really awkward environment. Unreal is harder to start in, but it lets you think about things in terms of your objectives. When it came to making enemy spawners, I used the thing that said spawn AI. When it came time to have enemies chase the player, I used the thing that said move. Then I said the target should be the player. In Scratch, I had to do all this. Now, Scratch wasn't worse at everything. The weapons were easier to make. They didn't really work right, but they were easy.
Oh, it works. It works. It works. It works. Okay. Never mind. It worked once and then not again.
In Unreal, I ran into some real development stuff with this. It was a whole thing. It was like half an hour worth of work just getting that part. But you know what? I Googled it, and Google told me where to go and what to do. And then it worked the way it was supposed to work. And when I went in to make the flying dagger, I wasn't really sure what type of thing I should use. So I poked around in what options Unreal had, and it had this thing called projectile movement. So I said to myself, this is a projectile, and it's supposed to move. So I went with that, and it worked. And to get it to fly, I didn't have to write any code. I didn't have to do any blueprints. I literally just put in the speed that it was supposed to fly at. Unreal is a big engine. There's thousands of options. When you get into serious Unreal development where you're using code, it's really tough for beginners. Let's be real though. Starting out, any game engine is hard. Unreal has much better tools for getting the beginner up to speed. So, Unreal Engine is a better choice for making games for a beginner. At least if you want to make action games, or shooters, or games with UI, or games in 3D. Or, you know what, let's just say you might want to start in Unreal.